It should have been a night of warm candlelight, chilled champagne, and a cake marking our 8th wedding anniversary. But just before my fingers touched the silver knife, my sister-in-law stood up, raising her phone like a gavel. The silent room expected to witness a cheating wife utterly exposed. They had no idea I had been waiting for this exact moment, ready to project a secret on the big screen that would tear her plot and this family apart. My name is Avery Parker, and I'm 35 years old. If my work at the Westmere Restoration Studio has taught me anything, it is that a beautifully painted surface can hide a rotting foundation. You just need to know where to press, to feel the wood give way. Tonight, the foundation was giving way right beneath my feet, disguised by the glow of warm amber lighting and the soft, rolling notes of a jazz quartet. This was our 8th wedding anniversary. My husband, Graham, and I were hosting the celebration at the Lantern House Inn, the historic coastal estate owned by the Parker family for generations, situated perfectly on the jagged shoreline of Blackwater Point, Georgia. To the untrained eye, the evening was flawless, almost aggressively so. The ballroom was a vision of wealth and legacy. Tables groaned under the weight of cascading white orchids, and crystal glasses caught the light, filled with vintage wine pulled from the deepest, most guarded corners of the Parker family cellar. It was the kind of opulence that was supposed to make you feel safe. Instead, the air in the room felt thick, heavy, and suffocating. I stood near the grand fireplace, a glass of sparkling water warming in my hand, and observed the room. I had spent years analyzing the structural integrity of old buildings, learning to spot the hairline fractures in load-bearing walls. Tonight, I was looking at a room full of people, and all I saw were fractures. Something was fundamentally wrong. The realization did not arrive like a sudden thunderclap. It seeped in slowly, like cold water rising around my ankles. It started with the glances. Over by the oyster bar, Aunt Helena caught my eye, froze, and then snapped her attention back to her plate with a speed that bordered on panic. A few minutes later, 2 of Graham's cousins stopped talking the exact second I walked past their table. They offered me tight, synchronized smiles that did not reach their eyes, as if they were looking at a ghost, or worse, someone they knew was about to be publicly ruined. They had heard a whisper, a rumor too scandalous to speak aloud, but far too delicious to ignore. I looked for Graham. He was across the room, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit, a confident smile plastered across his face. He was completely in his element, holding court with a group of local real estate investors and a few of his late father's oldest, most influential friends. Graham was a good man, a loving husband, but he possessed a fatal flaw when it came to his family. He was functionally blind to their toxicity. He thrived on peace and consensus. Right now, he was loudly recounting a story about the inn's early days, entirely oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere in the room was souring by the second. He thought we were surrounded by love. I knew we were surrounded by an audience waiting for the main act to begin. My gaze drifted through the crowd until it landed on the architect of this shifting atmosphere, my sister-in-law, Celeste Parker. Normally, Celeste was a woman who announced her presence with sharp, loud critiques. She was the kind of person who would compliment my dress by suggesting it was brave of me to wear something so outdated. But tonight, she was entirely stripped of her usual theatrical venom. She was quiet, and that silence was the most terrifying thing in the room. She stood near the edge of the dance floor, wearing a dark emerald gown that made her pale skin look almost translucent. She was watching me. There was no sneer on her lips, no dramatic roll of the eyes. Instead, she wore a look of cold, predatory confidence. It was the serene patience of a hunter who has already locked the cage door and is simply waiting for the prey to realize it is trapped. I watched her move. She did not mingle randomly. Her path was tactical. She glided specifically toward the most notoriously gossipy clusters of the Parker family extended network. She would lean in, her dark hair shielding her face, and whisper something, just a sentence or two. Then she would pull back, offer a sad, knowing sigh, and move on. Behind her, the laughter in those groups would die out, replaced by a low, frantic murmur, The room was no longer a party. It was a courtroom, and the jury was being tampered with in plain sight. Avery, darling, everything looks just wonderful. I turned to see my mother-in-law, Lorraine Parker. She was a woman crafted from old Southern money and ironclad manners, always impeccably dressed, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. But tonight, the facade was cracking. Her hands, usually so steady when pouring tea or signing checks, fluttered nervously against the silk of her skirt. She kept adjusting a diamond brooch on her lapel that was already perfectly centered. "Thank you, Lorraine," I said, keeping my voice even, soothing. The caterers really outdid themselves this year. She did not look at the food. Her eyes darted around the room, tracking Celeste's movements with a look of barely concealed dread. Lorraine was polite. She was refined. But she was a coward. She had spent her entire life turning a blind eye to the cruelty of her children, hoping that if she ignored the fire, it would eventually burn itself out. "Yes, well," Lorraine stammered, her voice tight. "It is a big milestone. 8 years. You and Graham have built quite a life here. I just hope, well, I hope tonight remains a celebration of that." She knew. She did not know the specifics, perhaps, but she felt the blade hanging over the room. She was looking at me with a mixture of pity and preemptive grief, mourning a conflict she felt entirely powerless to stop. She reached out, patted my arm with a trembling hand, and hurried away before I could ask her a single question. The jazz quartet finished their set, and the subtle hum of conversations morphed into a tense, expectant silence. A waiter stepped to the center of the room and gently tapped a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing cut through the heavy air, demanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graham's voice boomed, warm and full of affection as he took the microphone near the grand archway. "If I could have everyone's attention, please. It is time for the cake." A smattering of polite applause rippled through the crowd. Guests began to shift, forming a loose circle around the massive, 3-tiered vanilla cake sitting in the center of the room, illuminated by a spotlight. Graham caught my eye from across the distance, his smile wide and genuine, gesturing for me to join him. I started to walk toward him, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. Every step felt measured. The eyes of the room were on me, but they were not looking at a celebrated wife. They were looking at a woman walking to the gallows. As I neared the table, I glanced to my right. Celeste had positioned herself directly across from the cake, securing a spot in the very front row of the gathered crowd. She was not looking at her brother. She was staring directly into my eyes. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her right hand. Her fingers were wrapped tight around her smartphone. The screen was dark, but her knuckles were white from the grip. The serene, quiet observer was gone. In her place was a woman who was seconds away from pulling a trigger. As Graham reached out to hand me the silver cake knife, Celeste's lips curved into a slow, razor-sharp smile. She was ready to destroy my life, and I was ready to let her try. As Graham's fingers brushed against mine over the silver handle of the cake knife, the silence in the ballroom stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My eyes remained locked with Celeste's. Her smile was a jagged, cruel thing, carved from 8 years of quiet, simmering resentment. To truly understand the venom in her expression tonight, and the breathless anticipation of the guests around us, you had to look back to the very beginning. You had to look past the cascading orchids and the vintage wine, down into the fault lines of this family. I was not bred for this world of coastal estates, legacy trusts, and whispered lineage. I grew up in a modest, single-story ranch house in rural Missouri. In my childhood, money was not a tool for building empires. It was a finite resource measured carefully at the end of every single month. I paid for my university degrees with fiercely contested academic scholarships and waitressing shifts that routinely ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. Everything I possessed, my career at the Westmere Restoration Studio, my refined eye for architectural detail, and my unshakable quiet confidence, was built brick by brick with my own 2 hands. I never learned how to lean on someone else because, for the first 20-odd years of my life, There was simply no one there to catch me if I fell. That fierce, unyielding independence was exactly what drew Graham to me in the first place. He was exhausted by the fragile, carefully curated women of his social circle, women who treated marriage as a corporate merger. He told me on our third date that I was the first person he had ever met who felt completely solid, like a woman who had roots strong enough to crack concrete. He loved my stability. But that exact same quality made his younger sister despise me from the very second we were introduced. In Celeste's eyes, the Parker family was a private kingdom, and entry required a toll of absolute submission. You were supposed to be overwhelmed by their wealth, desperate for their social approval, and eternally grateful for their blessing to sit at their table. I was none of those things. I loved Graham deeply, but I did not need his family's illustrious name to validate my existence or my worth. To someone like Celeste, whose entire identity and sense of superiority were wrapped up in her last name, my self-sufficiency was an unforgivable, breathing insult. I was completely immune to her favorite weapon, which was manipulation through conditional generosity. I could not be bought, and therefore, I could not be controlled. The animosity between us only deepened and hardened after the wedding, right around the time I first started looking closely at the accounting books for the Lantern House Inn. For nearly a decade before my arrival, the historic property had been hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. It was running on pure local nostalgia and shockingly terrible management. Graham was drowning in the stress of it, and I stepped in. I did not do it to seize control. I did it to help the man I loved stop a catastrophic bleeding of family assets. I applied my professional background from the restoration studio, securing state historical grants to fund the massive, necessary structural repairs to the rotting east wing and the deteriorating Victorian rooflines. I overhauled their archaic booking systems and rebranded the property, elevating it from a dusty, forgotten bed and breakfast into a premier destination for high-end coastal weddings and corporate retreats. Within 3 years, we had not only stopped the financial hemorrhaging, but turned a consistent profit margin of 35%. I poured my sweat, my expertise, and my late nights into saving the very legacy Celeste loudly claimed to cherish. You would logically think that single-handedly saving the family estate from bankruptcy would earn me at least a basic level of respect, or perhaps a fragile truce. It did the exact opposite. My tangible success cemented my permanent status as the ultimate invader. I was the capable outsider who came in and effortlessly fixed the very thing they were too incompetent to manage themselves. Celeste could not stand the reality that the inn's glorious revival was heavily and publicly credited to my work. Since she could not attack my results, she began a relentless campaign of 1,000 tiny, socially acceptable cuts. Her insults were never loud, vulgar, or direct. They were always dipped in honey and delivered with a sympathetic smile. Avery has such a terrifying talent for making things look expensive, she would remark at crowded dinner parties, swirling her red wine and looking at the guests rather than at me. She is just so incredibly good at playing the perfect, devoted wife, do you not think? It is almost like watching a flawless theatrical performance. She deliberately framed my professional competence and my dedication to Graham as a coldly calculating power grab. She wanted every aunt, uncle, and local investor to believe I was merely weaponizing my aesthetic taste to slowly steal the Parker crown off her head. And through it all, year after agonizing year, Lorraine did absolutely nothing. My mother-in-law was a grandmaster of the graceful, cowardly pivot. Whenever Celeste crossed an invisible line, whenever a deeply personal comment hung in the dining room air dripping with obvious malice, Lorraine would suddenly become incredibly interested in the weather forecast for the weekend. Or she would compliment the floral centerpieces with frantic enthusiasm. Lorraine never treated me poorly to my face, but her perpetual silence was a distinct, heavy form of betrayal. It was the calculated choice of a mother who vastly preferred to close her eyes to the toxic rot inside her daughter rather than disrupt the delicate, beautiful illusion of a perfectly happy, upper-class family by continually refusing to check Celeste's behavior. Lorraine silently and powerfully endorsed the emotional abuse, but the hardest part for me to swallow was Graham's reaction. I loved my husband with every fiber of my being, but he possessed a blind spot the size of a mountain when it came to his sister's true nature. Graham is a fundamentally good man who craves peace and harmony above all other things. Whenever I tried, gently, to point out Celeste's quiet sabotage or her subtle attempts to undermine my authority with the inn's staff, he would massage his temples, close his eyes, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "She is just intimidated by your brilliance, Avery," he would say softly, wrapping his strong arms around my shoulders from behind. "She does not actually mean anything malicious by it. You know exactly how she gets when she feels insecure. Just let it roll off your back, please, for me." Graham was not being intentionally cruel or dismissive. He was just remarkably weak in the face of interpersonal conflict. He wanted so desperately for the three of us to get along that he consistently and dangerously underestimated the severe level of the threat she posed to our lives. He genuinely thought we were engaged in petty, standard sibling rivalry over attention. He did not possess the cynicism required to realize that Celeste was patiently waging a holy war for absolute dominance. So for 8 years, I endured it. I stayed perfectly quiet. I absorbed the passive-aggressive remarks about my clothing, the intentionally excluded invitations to family luncheons, and the relentless, subtle undermining of my character. I did not stay quiet because I was weak, or because I secretly agreed with her vicious assessment of my worth. I stayed quiet because I'm a deep pragmatist at heart. I firmly believed that a lasting, ironclad marriage could not possibly be sustained if I forced my husband onto a miserable battlefield every single week, demanding he draw a line in the sand and choose between his wife and his only sister. I chose to take the high road. I focused entirely on my demanding work, my devotion to my husband, and the beautiful, stable life we were building together against the odds. I truly thought my deliberate silence was a mature, impenetrable shield that would eventually bore her into submission and peace. I was tragically wrong. My silence was never a shield. It was a written invitation. It taught her that she could strike at me repeatedly without ever facing a single consequence. It allowed her to fatally mistake my disciplined restraint for pathetic passivity. As I stood there in the center of the ballroom, looking at the glowing black rectangle of the phone gripped so tightly in her hand, I saw the culmination of all those years of unchecked, festering hatred. The crowd pressing in around the anniversary cake was holding its collective breath, eagerly waiting for the slaughter. They looked at me and thought they were seeing a naive, unsuspecting woman about to be permanently blindsided and exiled. But they did not know about the terrifying things I had found hidden in the shadows over the past 21 days. They did not understand that my long, patient era of silence had abruptly ended the very moment I realized her petty domestic cruelty had mutated into a highly calculated, legally binding threat against everything I had built. The woman standing before them, bathed in the soft light of the chandelier, was not a helpless victim waiting to be ruined. I was simply a woman holding the door wide open, letting her enemy walk willingly and irrevocably into a trap she could never escape. Exactly 3 weeks before my sister-in-law stood in front of our guests with her phone raised like a weapon, the true betrayal began to surface. It did not announce itself with a dramatic confrontation or a whispered rumor. It started with a mundane, administrative glitch. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was logged into the master scheduling system at the front desk, trying to coordinate the vendor deliveries for the upcoming anniversary gala. As I scrolled through the shared digital calendar, a blocked-out event caught my eye. It was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning, the very morning after our anniversary party. The title read, Family Trust, Execution with Halcyon Shore Redevelopment. The name alone made my stomach tighten. Halcyon Shore was not a preservation society or a boutique hospitality group. They were a massive, aggressive corporate entity known entirely for buying up vulnerable, historic coastal properties, leveling them to the dirt, and erecting soulless, hyper-modern luxury condominiums in their place. That evening, as Graham was loosening his tie in our bedroom, I casually mentioned the calendar entry. I expected him to launch into a detailed explanation of some minor land lease or a vendor partnership. Instead, he just shrugged, looking thoroughly exhausted. "It is just a preliminary meeting," Graham said, tossing his tie over the back of an armchair. "Celeste says it is an exploratory development agreement. A chance to secure the family's financial future long term. She is handling the heavy lifting on the paperwork. Thank God." I stopped brushing my hair and looked at him in the mirror. "You are the primary executor of the estate. Graham, have you actually read the full proposal? The binding terms?" "She gave me the executive summary," he replied, rubbing his temples in that familiar gesture of conflict avoidance. "It all looks standard. We will sit down and go through the fine print together the morning after the party. Do not worry about it. Avery, let my sister feel useful for once." His blind trust was terrifying. A multi-million-dollar commercial real estate transaction was not something you simply skimmed over coffee the morning of the signing. The following afternoon, my unease drove me down into the basement archives of the inn. I had an entirely legitimate excuse to be there. I was pulling the original architectural blueprints for the East Garden gazebo, preparing for a spring restoration project. The archive room was a climate-controlled vault, smelling faintly of cedar and aging parchment, filled with decades of neatly catalogued Parker family history. But when I opened the heavy steel drawer labeled for property deeds and zoning variances, I found chaos. Folders that had been meticulously alphabetized for years were shoved in backward. Thick manila envelopes were dog-eared and unclasped. Someone had been in here recently, and they had been rummaging with desperate haste. My hands moved quickly, sorting the mess, until I noticed a glaring absence. The master zoning file was missing a crucial original appendix, the specific document that legally dictated the voting rights required to sell the 60 acres of undeveloped coastal land directly behind the inn. In its place was a newly inserted sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of an amended appendix, bearing the familiar, sweeping signature of Graham and Celeste's late father. On the surface, it looked perfectly legitimate. But I have spent my entire professional life authenticating historical documents and restoring antique materials. My eyes are trained to see what others gloss over. I held the paper up to the harsh fluorescent light of the archive room. The first discrepancy was the paper stock itself. The original files from that specific era were drafted on a heavy, textured cotton blend legal paper. This inserted page had a slight, glossy sheen and a brightness level that screamed modern commercial printing. Then, I looked closely at the notary stamp at the bottom. The late Mr. Parker had always used a heavy brass embossing press that left a deep, tactile groove in the paper. The stamp on this supposedly old document was completely flat, an obvious digital scan of a modern, self-inking rubber stamp, printed cleanly over the text. It was a forgery. And its sole purpose was to alter the family voting structure, heavily favoring whoever wanted to bypass Graham's ultimate veto power over the coastal land. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind went perfectly still, shifting into a cold, analytical gear. I needed to know who else was aware of this. The next morning, I found Lorraine in the sunroom, quietly sipping her Earl Grey tea and reading a gardening magazine. The morning light caught the deep lines of worry around her eyes, lines that seemed to have deepened significantly over the past month. I sat down across from her, keeping my voice light and conversational. "Lorraine, I was down in the archives yesterday looking for the gazebo plans," I said, watching her face carefully over the rim of my coffee mug. "I noticed some of the estate zoning files looked a bit disorganized. Has someone been pulling the old property deeds for the Halcyon Shore meeting?" The transformation was instantaneous and shocking. Lorraine's hand jerked, spilling a few drops of hot tea onto her porcelain saucer. Her polite, gentle demeanor vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive wall. She did not look me in the eye. "I really do not think you need to concern yourself with the archives, Avery," she said, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a sharp, scolding tone I had never heard her use before. "The adults in the family have the Halcyon matter completely handled. It is a private Parker estate issue. Please, leave the paperwork to us. The adults in the family." The words felt like a physical slap, but they also confirmed my worst fears. Lorraine was not just turning a blind eye to Celeste's usual social cruelty anymore. She was actively running interference. Someone was intentionally pushing me out of the information loop, isolating Graham by making sure his capable, detail-oriented wife was nowhere near the actual legal documents. Over the next few days, Celeste's behavior became bizarrely theatrical. She started cornering me in the hallways, offering overly enthusiastic monologues about the impending land deal. She repeatedly emphasized how desperately the family needed a massive influx of liquid cash to preserve the legacy of the inn. Her logic was entirely circular and deeply flawed. She was aggressively lobbying to sell off the most beautiful, pristine acreage of the estate, an act that would inherently involve bulldozing the historic seaside cottages, all under the guise of saving the property. She spoke fast, using aggressive corporate buzzwords, trying to overwhelm the conversation before I could ask any technical questions. It was not a debate about differing visions for the family business. It was a smokescreen. She was desperately trying to force a catastrophic, irreversible commercial deal through the pipeline before anyone sober and thorough could actually read the forged paperwork she had planted in the basement. I needed a thread to pull, a name attached to the other side of this hurried, shadowy transaction. I found it late one night when I was cross-referencing the vendor email server. Celeste had careless habits. She frequently forwarded emails to the front desk printer and forgot to retrieve the cover sheets. I found one crumpled in the recycling bin. It was a chain regarding the preliminary site survey. The content was standard, but the recipient list was a revelation. The name Elias Mercer appeared 34 times in a single chain. He was listed in the signature block as the primary legal and commercial liaison for Halcyon Shore redevelopment. What struck me as incredibly strange was the timing of the correspondence. Elias Mercer and my sister-in-law were not just exchanging formal business emails during standard banking hours. There were rapid-fire replies timestamped at 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and all throughout the weekends. The tone of her messages to him was urgent, demanding, and highly secretive. I sat alone in the glow of the computer monitor, staring at Elias Mercer's name, piecing the puzzle together. If this development agreement was truly a golden opportunity to save the Parker family legacy, as Celeste so loudly claimed, why was it being negotiated in the dark of night? Why were the original deeds being swapped for cheap forgeries? And why was the family matriarch suddenly terrified of her own daughter's business dealings? A legitimate real estate transaction is celebrated with handshakes and press releases. This deal was being guarded like a shameful, toxic secret. Someone was preparing to steal the ground right out from under my husband's feet, and they knew I was the only person standing in the way who could do the math. It happened at exactly 2 in the morning. Graham was fast asleep beside me, his breathing a steady, heavy rhythm in the dark confines of our bedroom. My phone, resting face down on the mahogany nightstand, vibrated with a single, sharp pulse. It was not a late-night text message or a calendar reminder. It was a high-priority security alert from my personal cloud storage account. I blinked against the harsh blue light of the screen. The notification detailed a new login from an unrecognized device. This was not a random, failed spam attempt from halfway across the globe. It was a successful breach, followed by an abrupt logout. Mere minutes later, someone had unlocked the front door of my digital life, stepped inside, grabbed what they needed, and vanished like a ghost. Slipping silently out of bed, I took my laptop into the master bathroom and locked the door. I bypassed the main screen and dug straight into the security access logs. The intruder had not touched my banking details or my emails. Instead, they had executed a highly targeted extraction. They had downloaded a very specific batch of old photographs from business trips I took to Chicago and Denver nearly 4 years ago. Alongside the images, they had pulled the digital PDF receipts of my hotel booking histories from those exact same dates. I sat on the edge of the cold porcelain bathtub, the glow of the screen illuminating the tight knot in my stomach. You do not steal 4-year-old hotel receipts for financial gain. You steal them to build a narrative. The shape of that narrative revealed itself the very next day. At roughly 11 o'clock in the morning, I was alone in the cramped administrative office tucked behind the main reception desk of the Lantern House Inn. I was auditing the floral invoices when the heavy commercial laser printer in the corner suddenly whirred to life. It spat out 5 crisp pages into the receiving tray and then fell silent. No one else was in the room. No one came to collect the documents. I walked over and picked them up. The breath completely left my lungs. Printed in high-resolution black and white were screenshots of a text message conversation. The contact name at the top of the chat bubble read, Elias Mercer. The messages themselves were a masterclass in fabricated intimacy. They were flirtatious, breathless, and deeply damning. The language attempted to mimic my professional, grounded tone, but the cadence was slightly off. The sentences were too smooth, too perfectly engineered to incriminate. One message read, I cannot wait to see you again. Graham suspects nothing. Another referenced a secret meeting in a hotel lobby. I stood frozen, staring at the pages. But I was not paralyzed by fear. I was paralyzed by the sheer, audacious scale of the lie. I had never texted Elias Mercer anything outside of formal, heavily structured corporate emails regarding the coastal property survey. I had never even saved his personal phone number. Behind the text screenshots was a printed copy of one of the hotel bills stolen from my cloud account the night before. Attached to that was a blurry, grainy photograph of a woman walking down a dimly lit hotel hallway. She had her back to the camera, but the dark hair and the tailored trench coat were undeniably mine. It was a candid shot from a charity gala I had attended years prior, now violently stripped of its context and repurposed to look like a woman sneaking away for an illicit rendezvous. But the most terrifying detail was the final page. It was a scan of a small, yellow sticky note. Scrawled across it in hurried, sharp handwriting was a single directive. If needed, release on Saturday night before the signing. Saturday night, the night of our 8th wedding anniversary party. The night before the family trust was scheduled to sign the massive coastal development agreement with Halcyon Shore. The trap was fully set, and the jaws were waiting to snap shut. The person who printed these pages from a remote network connection wanted me to find them. They were waiting for me to react. They wanted me to burst into tears, tear the pages into shreds, and run down the hallway in a blind panic. They wanted me to look exactly like a guilty, desperate wife whose terrible secret had just been uncovered. I did not panic. I folded the 5 pages neatly in half, slipped them into the inner pocket of my blazer, and walked out of the office with my head held high and my expression completely blank. I drove into town on my lunch break and parked my car in the empty lot behind the local library. I pulled out a burner phone I kept for emergency vendor contacts and dialed the only person I trusted to dismantle a digital bomb. Her name was Naomi Bell. Naomi and I had shared a tiny, freezing dormitory room during our freshman year of college, and she now ran a boutique cybersecurity firm out of Atlanta. She was not a woman you called for emotional comfort. You called her when you needed the ruthless, mathematical truth. I am sending you a secure file right now, I said the second she picked up the line. I need you to strip the metadata, trace the routing origin, and tell me exactly how these images were manufactured. I need it done quietly, and I need it done fast. Give me 45 minutes, Naomi replied, her voice dropping into a sharp, professional register. I sat in the stifling heat of my parked car and waited. Exactly 42 minutes later, my phone rang. It is a sloppy frame job, Avery, Naomi stated flatly. The blurry hallway photograph? The internal EXIF data shows it was artificially cropped and digitally resaved exactly 24 hours ago. The timestamp on the file is completely fractured. As for the text messages, they were not extracted from a cellular network provider. The pixel alignment around the text bubbles is a dead giveaway. They were generated using a commercial interface spoofing application. It is a fake messaging generator you can download for $3 on any app store. Someone typed both sides of that conversation themselves. Thank you. Naomi, save the forensic report. I am going to need it. I ended the call. The pieces were locking into place, but I needed to confirm the other half of the equation. I needed to know if Elias Mercer was the architect of this smear campaign, or simply an unwitting prop. I dialed the main corporate number for Halcyon Shore redevelopment and bypassed the receptionist by requesting the legal compliance extension. When Elias picked up, I did not bother with a polite introduction. Mr. Mercer, this is Avery Parker. I am calling to ask why there is a fabricated dossier circulating in my family's private office that suggests you and I have been engaging in a long-term romantic affair. There was a profound, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was high, tight, and completely stripped of its usual corporate polish. He sounded like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. Mrs. Parker, I swear to you, I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I have never spoken to you outside of the official property assessment meetings. My God, if a rumor like that reaches my board of directors, it will completely invalidate my position on this acquisition. His panic was entirely genuine. He was a ruthless corporate lawyer, but he was not a suicidal one. An affair with the vendor's wife would destroy his career. Then you need to tell me exactly who has been asking you about me. Elias. Right now. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before the instinct for self-preservation took over. Your sister-in-law, he confessed, his breath hitching. Celeste Parker called me late last week. She asked for some highly specific personal details about your background and your travel schedule. She claimed the family was preparing a large public relations push for the new property development, and she needed a comprehensive biography to manage your media presence. I sent her a few dates from our preliminary scheduling emails. That is all I did. I swear it. I hung up the phone without another word. The truth settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ice. This was never about a petty family rivalry. This was not about Celeste simply hating the woman her brother married. This was a highly calculated, legally strategic assassination of my character. Celeste knew I had the expertise to look at the forged voting rights appendix and instantly recognize it as a fake. She knew I could do the math on the coastal land deal and realized she was selling out the family legacy for a quick, devastating profit. She could not block my access to the documents forever, so she decided to destroy my credibility instead. If she publicly exposed me as a lying, cheating, manipulative wife on Saturday night in front of the entire town, Graham would be completely shattered. By the time Sunday morning rolled around for the final contract signing, I would be a pariah. My husband would not look at me, let alone listen to my warnings about forged notary stamps and secret real estate clauses. Anything I said would be immediately dismissed as the desperate, venomous lies of a scorned woman trying to ruin a business deal out of pure spite. She wanted to kill my voice right before the most important financial decision in the history of the Parker family. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. She had meticulously built a guillotine with my name carved into the wood. She just did not realize I had already found the lever, and I was going to be the one to pull it. The next 4 days were an exercise in absolute, unyielding psychological warfare. I did not confront my sister-in-law. I did not storm into the family dining room demanding an apology, and I certainly did not let a single tear fall. When you realize you are locked in a cage with a predator, the worst possible move you can make is to bleed. Instead, I chose to become a ghost. I maintained my daily routine at the inn with chilling precision. Whenever our paths crossed in the grand lobby or during the weekly staff meetings, I offered Celeste the exact same polite, measured smile I had given her for 8 years. I asked her about her floral arrangements for the upcoming party. I complimented her choice of table linens. I gave her absolutely no reason to suspect that her guillotine had been discovered. I needed her to believe her poisonous little plan was perfectly intact, while I played the role of the oblivious, dedicated wife on the surface, beneath it. I was systematically dismantling her entire operation. I started with the digital trail. Naomi called me on my secure burner phone late Tuesday afternoon with the final forensic breakdown of the fabricated text messages. The print command did not come from a random guest network, Naomi explained, her voice sharp and rapid over the encrypted line. I traced the internal protocol address back to the primary administrative terminal at the front desk. Specifically, it was sent from the user account belonging to your office manager, Brenda. Brenda would never do that, I said, frowning at the steering wheel of my parked car. She has been with the inn for 20 years. She adores Graham and me. I know she did not do it, Naomi replied instantly. I pulled the employee time cards. Brenda swiped out for her lunch break at exactly 12:30 in the afternoon. The command to print those 5 pages was sent to the laser printer at 12:45. Someone used a remote access gateway to hijack her logged-in terminal while her desk was empty. They routed the fake documents through her computer to make it look like an internal leak. It is clever, but it leaves a massive digital footprint if you know exactly where to shine a flashlight. I thanked Naomi and immediately drove back to the inn. I bypassed the front desk and went straight into the server room, a cramped, windowless closet humming with cooling fans. I logged into the master security system that governed the electronic door locks throughout the entire property. If Celeste was orchestrating remote hacks and forging land documents, she had to be physically accessing the basement archives to plant the fake zoning appendix. I pulled the entry logs for the heavy steel door of the record room. The screen illuminated the truth in stark, glowing green text. Celeste had used her personal, unique access code to unlock the archive room 3 distinct times within the last 7 days. The times were entirely damning: Tuesday at 11 o'clock at night, Thursday at 2 in the morning, and Friday just before dawn. In the 8 years I had known her, Celeste had never once shown an ounce of interest in the dusty historical ledgers or the property deeds. Now, on the eve of a multi-million-dollar land sale, she was making midnight runs into the vault, but I needed irrefutable, legal proof that the document she planted was a forgery. The digital discrepancies I noticed were enough to raise my suspicions, but they would not hold up against a lawyer in a boardroom. I needed the original source. Through old county records, I tracked down Martha Keene. She was the retired notary public who had handled all the Parker family estate paperwork a decade ago. She lived in a quiet, sun-faded bungalow on the outskirts of the county. When I sat at her kitchen table and handed her a high-resolution color scan of the suspicious voting appendix, the elderly woman did not even need a magnifying glass. Martha adjusted her silver-rimmed reading glasses and traced her finger over the flat, perfectly black ink of the stamp. "This is absolutely not my handiwork, Avery," Martha stated firmly, her voice raspy but resolute. "Look at the alignment of the date column. My old office typewriter had a sticky key for the number 9. It always struck a fraction of a millimeter higher than the rest of the line. This text is flawlessly aligned, perfectly kerned digital font. Furthermore, the ink composition on this stamp is all wrong. I used a custom, oil-based ink pad that bled slightly into the cotton fibers of the paper. This is modern laser toner. Would you be willing to testify to that fact in a formal family trust meeting?" I asked quietly. Martha sighed, taking off her glasses and rubbing her tired eyes. "I cannot make a formal legal accusation based solely on a visual inspection of a photocopy. I need my original, bound notary ledger from that specific year to prove that this document was never officially registered in my presence. Those ledgers are in a storage unit 2 towns over. Give me 48 hours to dig through the boxes. I promise you, I will find the original stamp sample and the registration log." I had my confirmation. Now, I needed the motive. I already knew she wanted the land sold, but I needed to know exactly why she was willing to destroy her own brother to make it happen. I called Elias Mercer one final time. I did not ask questions. I gave commands. I told him I had the digital forensics proving his involvement in a targeted harassment campaign against me. I told him I would forward the entire file to the State Ethics Board before the sun went down unless he gave me the missing piece of the puzzle. Elias cracked completely. The polished corporate attorney dissolved into a terrified, desperate man trying to save his own license. "There is a secondary clause," Elias confessed, his voice trembling so violently the audio clipped. "Celeste demanded a highly confidential financial rider be attached to the final Halcyon Shore agreement. If the board of directors or Graham finds out about the specific terms of this rider, the entire acquisition will be terminated immediately. Halcyon will walk away from the table, and the sale will be dead." The entire architecture of Celeste's trap suddenly crystallized in my mind. The fake cheating scandal was never the actual endgame. It was merely a tactical smokescreen. She was preparing to detonate this fabricated affair right in the middle of our anniversary party for one specific, devastating reason: to shatter Graham's trust in me on Saturday night. If I was publicly branded a liar and an adulterer, Graham would be too humiliated, too heartbroken, and too angry to let me anywhere near the official estate signing on Sunday morning. I would be locked out of the boardroom. I would be silenced, and with the only person capable of reading the fine print completely neutralized, Celeste would be free to slide her forged voting appendix and her secret, venomous writer right across the mahogany table. Graham would sign away the family legacy without ever realizing the pen was loaded with poison. Most people, armed with this explosive knowledge, would have taken the evidence straight to their husband. They would have canceled the party, locked the doors, and screamed the truth in the safety of their living room. I did not do that. If I stopped the slander before it happened, Celeste would simply pivot. She would deny everything, claim I was paranoid, and find another, more insidious way to force the sale through. I realized that the only way to permanently neutralize her threat was to let her execute her plan in front of an audience. I needed her to stand up in front of the entire Parker family, the local investors, and the town elite, and confidently bet her entire reputation on a lie. Only then, when she was standing there in triumph at the very edge of her illusion, would I pull away the last thing holding her up. On Friday night, long after the catering staff had gone home and the inn had fallen silent, I walked alone into the grand ballroom. The tables were already set with crystal and silver. The stage was ready. I approached the audiovisual control podium tucked discreetly in the corner of the room. I connected my personal laptop to the main server that controlled the massive projector screen hanging above the dance floor. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I created a heavily encrypted, hidden folder on the main presentation drive. Inside, I loaded the digital forensic report from Naomi, the remote login times from the front desk, the smart lock access logs showing her midnight trips to the archive, and the audio recording of Elias Mercer's frantic confession. I organized every single piece of evidence into a sequential, devastating slide deck, but I left the final slide completely blank. The most crucial piece of the puzzle, the secret financial writer that Elias had warned me about, was still locked away. I knew I could not win this war with just technical data. I had to let Celeste speak. I had to let her twist the knife so deeply into the family that when I finally pulled it out and showed everyone the blood on her hands, there would be absolutely no room for forgiveness and no place left for her to hide. The evening unfolded with a terrifying, breathtaking perfection. To anyone looking through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the ballroom, it was a flawless celebration of love and endurance. The string quartet played a seamless rotation of classical standards and slow weeping jazz. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided silently across the polished hardwood, carrying silver trays of chilled oysters and towering flutes of champagne. I walked among our 200 guests, smiling until my cheeks ached, accepting warm handshakes and soft kisses on the cheek. I thanked them for their kind words about our 8 years of marriage. I acted exactly like a woman who had absolutely no idea she was the main attraction in a public execution. The air in the room was socially toxic, heavy with the electric hum of a scandal waiting to break. I could feel the subtle shift in the temperature every time I turned my back. The eyes tracking me were not filled with admiration. They were filled with a morbid, hungry curiosity. I kept my gaze carefully neutral, but my attention was entirely fixed on Celeste. She was putting on a masterclass in social manipulation. She did not waste her time mingling with the younger cousins or her own wealthy friends by the open bar. Instead, she was strategically targeting the most dangerous demographic in the room. I watched her pull Great Aunt Beatrice into a quiet corner near the floral arches. Beatrice was a notoriously strict, deeply religious woman who still believed divorce was an unforgivable moral failing. Celeste leaned in close to the older woman, her face a mask of tragic concern, whispering something that made Beatrice gasp softly and press a trembling hand to her pearl necklace. Moments later, Celeste detached herself from Beatrice and glided smoothly toward a cluster of older men standing near the fireplace. These were the conservative, old money investors who held significant influence over the local town council. They were the men Graham needed on his side to approve any future expansions of the inn. Celeste stood among them, shaking her head sadly as she spoke in hushed tones. Whatever she was saying, it was designed to maximize their outrage. She was meticulously preparing her audience, ensuring that when she finally dropped the guillotine, the most powerful people in the room would instantly turn into an angry, unforgiving mob. Through it all, Graham remained completely oblivious. He was laughing warmly, shaking hands, and pouring drinks, entirely convinced that this was the happiest night of our lives. At one point, he broke away from a conversation and stepped up behind me, wrapping his arms securely around my waist. "You are wound tight as a drum, sweetheart," Graham murmured into my ear, kissing the side of my head. "Your shoulders are completely rigid." I forced my muscles to relax, leaning back into his solid frame. "It is just the stress of hosting so many people, Graham. I want everything to be perfect for tonight." "It is perfect," he assured me, squeezing my waist gently. "The food is incredible, the music is beautiful, and my wife is the most gorgeous woman in the state. Stop managing the event and just enjoy our anniversary. The caterers have the timeline completely under control." He smiled at me, a look of pure, uncomplicated love radiating from his eyes. It broke my heart for a fraction of a second. His emotional blind spot regarding his family was so profound that he could not sense the temperature of the room plummeting around him. He thought I was just exhausted from picking out table linens. He had no idea I was bracing for a war. I kissed his cheek, agreed to relax, and watched him walk back into the crowd, completely defenseless. Across the room, Lorraine was standing near the towering, multi-tiered wedding cake. My mother-in-law looked physically ill. She was twisting a heavy linen napkin in her hands, her knuckles white with strain. Several times, I saw her take a determined step toward Celeste, her mouth open as if she were finally going to intervene, to pull her daughter out of the ballroom and demand she stop this madness. But every single time, Lorraine stopped short. She would look around at the wealthy guests, panic flashing in her eyes, and retreat into the shadows. She was terrified of the impending destruction, but she was far more terrified of causing a scene. Her cowardice was a silent endorsement of the slaughter. It was then that I noticed the dining arrangements had been tampered with. I had personally finalized the seating chart 2 days ago. I had placed Elias Mercer at table number 19, tucked safely in the back corner near the swinging kitchen doors, appropriately distanced from the family tables. But as I scanned the room, I saw Elias sitting dead center at table number 3. He was positioned directly beneath a massive crystal chandelier, illuminated like a stage actor. He looked deeply uncomfortable, tugging at the collar of his suit and aggressively avoiding eye contact with anyone. Celeste had moved his place card. She had dragged him out of the shadows and placed him exactly where the entire room could see him clearly. He was her living, breathing prop, completely unaware that he was about to be cast as the villain in her twisted play. The most terrifying realization of the hour came when Arthur Vance, one of the oldest and most respected friends of Graham's late father, stepped into my path. He was holding a glass of neat scotch, and his usually warm expression was replaced by a tight, uncomfortable grimace. "Avery, my dear," Arthur said, keeping his voice painfully low. "The property looks magnificent tonight." "Thank you. Arthur, we are so glad you could join us to celebrate." He hesitated, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I must ask, though, is everything quite all right with that coastal development firm? Halcyon Shore, is it?" My pulse spiked, but I kept my smile frozen in place. "Everything is moving along exactly as planned. Why do you ask?" "Well," Arthur cleared his throat, looking nervously over my shoulder. "One hears things, whispers, you know. I was just wondering if things were getting a bit too personal over there. These corporate acquisition types can be terribly aggressive. and one must be careful not to get too closely entangled with them outside of the boardroom. For Graham's sake. He patted my arm awkwardly and hurried away before I could respond. The blood roared in my ears. The rumors had not just started tonight. Celeste had not just whispered to Great Aunt Beatrice. She had been systematically leaking this fabricated scandal to Graham's closest allies for days. She had primed the entire town to doubt my fidelity. I needed a moment to breathe. I slipped away from the main floor and pushed through the heavy wooden doors leading into the catering kitchen. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The air was thick with the smell of roasting lamb, melted butter, and the frantic, chaotic energy of 20 chefs moving in synchronized panic. I stood near the stainless steel dishwashing station, leaning my hip against the cold metal counter. My phone vibrated sharply in the pocket of my silk skirt. I pulled it out. It was a secure text message from Naomi. The words on the screen were short, precise, and absolute. Martha just called me. She found the archival ledger from 1998. She sent the high-resolution photographs to the secure server. The notary index proves unequivocally that the coastal appendix does not exist in the official state registry. Her seal was forged. It is a total fabrication. You have the final piece of the puzzle. I stared at the glowing letters for a long time. The chaotic noise of the kitchen seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of my own slow, steady breathing. The trap was complete. All the anxiety, the fear, and the suffocating tension of the past 3 weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I locked the screen. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, lifted my chin, and pushed through the wooden doors, walking back out into the glittering, poisoned ballroom as if absolutely nothing in the world had changed. A sudden, sharp ringing cut through the soft jazz music. The master of ceremonies, a man in a pristine tuxedo, stood near the grand archway, gently tapping a silver spoon against his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I please have your attention?" His voice boomed over the speakers, warm and inviting. "If I could ask everyone to gather near the center of the room, it is time to honor our hosts. Graham and Avery, would you please step forward for the cutting of the anniversary cake?" A polite, expectant applause rippled through the crowd. The guests parted, forming a large circle around the magnificent vanilla cake bathed in a solitary spotlight. Graham appeared at my side, taking my hand in his. His palm was warm, his grip reassuring. We walked together into the center of the circle. The entire room fell into a breathless hush. Graham reached out, picking up the heavy silver cake knife with his right hand, and gently guided my hand to rest on top of his. We stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to make the first cut. I looked up, directly across the cake. Celeste was sitting at the closest table, perfectly positioned in the front row. As the silver blade hovered a fraction of an inch above the pristine white frosting, the scraping sound of a wooden chair pushing forcefully against the hardwood floor echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. Slowly, deliberately. Celeste stood up. The silver knife was suspended exactly 1 inch above the smooth vanilla frosting. The string quartet had faded to a gentle, lingering hum, leaving the ballroom in a state of quiet, joyful anticipation. Then came the voice. "Stop, please. Just stop." Celeste's voice was not a shout. It was a perfectly calibrated, trembling projection that carried effortlessly into every corner of the silent room. Graham froze, the knife handle slipping slightly in his grip. He turned his head toward his sister, a confused, indulgent smile still clinging to his face. "Celeste, what is it? We are right in the middle of the toast." Celeste stepped fully away from her table, moving directly into the harsh edge of the spotlight. She pressed one hand flat against her chest, a gesture of profound, manufactured agony. "I cannot do this," she breathed out, shaking her head slowly. "I cannot stand here and drink champagne and watch you celebrate a lie. I cannot continue to pretend to be happy when Graham deserves to know the truth." The collective intake of breath from 200 guests sounded like a vacuum pulling the oxygen completely out of the room. Celeste raised her right arm, holding her smartphone high so the glowing screen was visible to the front row of the gathered crowd. "I am so sorry. Graham," she sobbed, a single, flawless tear tracking down her pale cheek. "I wanted to protect you. I tried to keep quiet, but my conscience simply will not allow me to let her make a fool of you in front of our entire family." She swiped her finger across the screen, her hand trembling with rehearsed distress. "Avery has been lying to all of us. She has been having an affair." The word dropped onto the polished hardwood floor like a heavy iron weight. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Celeste did not give anyone time to recover from the shock. She looked down at her screen and began to read the fabricated messages, her voice thick with fake revulsion. "I cannot wait to see you again. Graham suspects absolutely nothing. He is completely blind." She paused, letting the cruel words sink into the velvet drapery of the ballroom. "Meet me at the same hotel. Room 412. Graham's face drained of all color. The healthy, warm flush in his cheeks vanished, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. His hand dropped from mine as if my skin had suddenly caught fire. He took a single, unsteady step backward. Celeste kept pushing, turning the knife deeper. "I found the digital receipts. Graham, I have a hotel billing statement from a trip she claimed was for a restoration conference in Chicago 3 years ago. It was billed for 2 adult guests, and I have a photograph, a candid shot of her walking down the corridor of that exact hotel, heading toward his room. The man she has been seeing is sitting right here in this room." "That is a complete fabrication." The desperate shout came from table number 3. Elias Mercer leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the floor. His face was slick with sudden, panicked sweat. He pointed a shaking finger at Celeste. "I have never engaged in any inappropriate relationship with Mrs. Parker. This is an outrageous, defamatory lie. I am simply here for the commercial real estate survey." It was the worst possible reaction. Elias was a corporate shark, a man paid to remain utterly composed under pressure. Right now, he looked erratic, terrified, and violently defensive. To the wealthy, conservative guests staring at him, his frantic denial did not look like righteous indignation. It looked exactly like the desperate flailing of a guilty man caught dead to rights. He was sweating, his eyes darting toward the exits, cementing his own guilt in the court of public opinion. The whispers began. They started at the tables occupied by the oldest Parker relatives and spread outward like a fast-moving infection. "I always knew there was something off about her," a woman hissed loudly near the melting ice sculpture. "She was always entirely too perfect," another voice muttered from the shadows near the bar. "You cannot trust a woman who marries into money and acts like she earned it. The arrogance is finally catching up with her." They were weaponizing 8 years of quiet prejudice. The town elite had never fully forgiven me for not having a trust fund or a recognizable maiden name. Now, presented with a convenient, scandalous narrative, they eagerly seized the opportunity to tear me down. They did not need a trial or forensic evidence. Celeste had given them a spectacular show, and they were already sharpening their pitchforks, thrilled to witness the downfall of the ambitious outsider. I looked at Lorraine. My mother-in-law was sitting at the head family table, completely paralyzed. Her silver dessert fork slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting her fine china plate with a sharp, discordant clatter. She stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, but she did not say a single word. She did not stand up. She did not defend her son's wife, nor did she reprimand her daughter. She simply surrendered to the chaos, sinking lower into her chair, letting Celeste burn the family to the ground rather than risk raising her own voice. Then, I looked at my husband. Graham seemed to shrink inside his tailored tuxedo. The confident, booming host from 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a fractured, shattered man. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The betrayal he was processing was so immense it had temporarily severed his vocal cords. He looked from his weeping sister back to me, his eyes entirely hollowed out. He looked like a man who had just survived a massive collision and could not comprehend why his chest was bleeding. He wanted to believe me. I could see the desperate, frantic plea in his gaze. He needed me to scream, to cry, to violently deny the accusations. He needed a lifeline, something heavy and solid to hold on to in the middle of the hurricane his sister had just unleashed. But if I panicked, if I reacted with the hysterical, tearful defense they all expected, I would validate the premise of her argument. I would become the cornered, emotional woman trying to lie her way out of a trap. I would lose my leverage, and I would lose the war. So, I did none of those things. I stood perfectly still under the bright glare of the spotlight. I did not raise my hands defensively. I did not reach out to touch Graham. I slowly turned my body away from my husband and faced my sister-in-law. Celeste was breathing heavily, a tragic, triumphant heroine, soaking in the shock and awe of her audience. She was a virtuoso of vengeance. She met my gaze, expecting to see absolute defeat. She expected to see a shattered woman begging for mercy, humiliated in front of everyone she knew. Instead, I looked at her, and I smiled. It was not a defensive smirk. It was a genuine, serene, and utterly ice-cold smile. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous. The vicious whispering died in the back of their throats. The frantic, predatory energy of the crowd abruptly flatlined. A woman caught in a devastating public lie does not smile with that kind of terrifying, absolute calm. The guests shifted uncomfortably, the collective certainty suddenly wavering. Something was wrong with the script. The victim was not playing her part. I let the heavy silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, making sure every single person in the room was hanging on my next breath. I looked at the glowing smartphone still clutched tightly in Celeste's raised hand. "If you want everyone to see everything," I said, my voice perfectly level, ringing clear and sharp through the silent ballroom, "then connect your phone to the big screen." The massive audiovisual system in the ballroom had been installed specifically for corporate retreats and high-end wedding montages. When I gave the command, a heavy mechanical hum resonated from the ceiling. A pristine, white projector screen smoothly descended behind the main stage, spanning nearly 20 feet across. The audiovisual technician, following the strict instructions I had given him hours before the party began, routed the wireless connection directly to the public display network. Within seconds, the screen flared to life. The harsh to bright light washed over the shocked faces of our 200 guests. Celeste did not hesitate. Driven by pure, vindictive adrenaline, she tapped the screen mirroring icon on her device. Suddenly, the fabricated text messages were magnified to the size of a billboard. The blurry photograph of the hotel hallway loomed over us like a towering monument to my supposed infidelity. Seeing the evidence projected on such a massive scale gave it an instant, horrifying sense of legitimacy. The crowd gasped again. The murmurs grew louder, harder, and significantly more hostile. They were no longer just whispering. They were audibly turning against me. To them, the giant black text bubbles and the grainy hotel receipt were absolute, undeniable proof. Celeste stood taller, her chest heaving with theatrical righteousness. She thought the sheer scale of the projection would crush me. She did not realize I had asked for the screen so everyone in the back row could clearly read her own death warrant. "Do not just show them the pictures, Celeste," I said, my voice cutting through the rising noise of the room. "If you are going to dismantle an 8-year marriage in front of our entire community, you owe my husband the courtesy of precision. Read the timestamps on those messages." Loudly. Celeste blinked, momentarily thrown by my absolute lack of panic. She looked at Graham, expecting him to silence me, but Graham was staring at the giant screen, his jaw tight, his eyes darting frantically across the text. When he did not intervene, Celeste raised her chin, determined to drive the final nail into my coffin. "October 12th, Celeste announced, her voice echoing through the microphone she had snatched from the podium. "At 8:15 in the evening. And the date on the hotel billing statement?" I asked, taking a slow, measured step toward her. "November 18th, she fired back, glaring at me. 2 years ago. Room 412. Perfect, I replied, nodding once. I turned my back to her and faced the crowd. Let us start with the photograph. The one you claim is a candid shot of me sneaking down the corridor to meet Elias Mercer. I pointed up at the massive, grainy image. It is a clever crop, I will admit, but if you look closely at the bottom edge of the frame, right beneath the hem of that black trench coat, you can see 3 inches of a sapphire blue silk skirt. I scanned the front row of tables until I found Arthur Vance. Arthur, you and your lovely wife have an exceptional memory for evening wear. Do you happen to remember the dress I wore to the Children's Hospital Charity Gala in November 2 years ago? Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The entire room turned to look at him. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting from the screen to me. Well, yes, Margaret complimented the beadwork on it. It was a very distinct shade of sapphire. Thank you, Arthur, I said smoothly. There were over 400 guests at that charity gala. It was heavily photographed. I was not sneaking through a secretive hotel corridor. I was walking down the main hallway of the grand ballroom, surrounded by local press. That proves nothing, Celeste shouted, her voice losing its tragic cadence and slipping into something much sharper. It is just a similar color. You are trying to distract them. I do not need to distract anyone, I countered, looking past her toward the back of the room. Naomi, if you would. At table number 12, Naomi Bell did not stand up. She simply tapped a command onto the tablet resting on her lap. Instantly, the giant screen flickered. The fabricated text messages disappeared, replaced by a stark black window filled with dense, glowing green lines of code. It was the digital metadata file for the photograph. For those in the room who are unfamiliar with digital forensics, I explained, my voice steady and instructional. Every photograph taken or saved on a modern device carries a hidden digital footprint. It records exactly when an image was created, what device was used, and when it was last altered. The data currently on the screen belongs to the photograph Celeste just showed you. I walked closer to the screen, pointing at a highlighted line of text. As you can all clearly see, the origin timestamp is fractured. A motion blur filter was artificially applied to obscure the background. But most importantly, the file was resaved and exported to a new folder exactly 2 days ago, at 4 in the afternoon. A new, entirely different kind of silence fell over the ballroom. It was the silence of a crowd realizing they were watching a magic trick being aggressively dismantled. Now, let us examine the text messages, I continued, pacing slowly in front of the stage. The screen switched back to the giant chat bubbles. There are a few stylistic errors. The sender uses a double space after every single period. I have never typed with a double space in my entire life. Furthermore, the sender refers to my husband as Gray. I have never called Graham by that nickname, but those are just minor details. Let us look at the timeline you just read aloud. I turned to face Celeste directly. Her pale skin was beginning to flush with a creeping, panicked red. October 12th, at 8:15 in the evening, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. I remember that exact night very clearly. I was traveling to a historical preservation seminar in Seattle. At 8:15 in the evening, I was sitting in seat 4A on a Delta Airlines flight, cruising at 30,000 feet. The aircraft did not have functional wireless internet. It is physically impossible for my phone to have sent those messages to Elias Mercer. You are lying, Celeste snapped, her voice cracking. She gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward aggressively. You are just throwing out technical jargon to confuse everyone. The exact dates might be slightly jumbled in the download process, but the core truth remains. You are having an affair. It was the pivot I had been waiting for. In her desperate attempt to salvage her narrative, she had just completely contradicted her own opening statement. The core truth? I asked, tilting my head slightly. 10 minutes ago, you stood before this entire room with tears in your eyes. You claimed you were heartbroken. You told my husband that you just discovered this horrifying secret on my phone today, and that your conscience simply forced you to ruin our anniversary party because you could not bear the deception. I looked at Naomi again. The screen flashed one final time. A stark, white administrative document appeared on the projection. It was bordered by the official logo of the Lantern House Inn. "This is the internal network print log from the front desk of this very building," I declared, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "It records every single document sent to the main laser printer. Look at the highlighted row." 3 days ago, at 12:45 in the afternoon, a 5-page document titled Evidence Dossier was printed. The pages match the exact screenshots you're holding right now. I walked right up to the podium, stopping just 2 feet away from her. The air between us was electric with hostility. "You did not discover anything on my phone today, Celeste," I stated coldly, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. "You manufactured this entire package days ago. You printed it out, you saved the edited files, and you patiently waited for a ballroom full of investors and family members to serve as your audience." The emotional current in the room violently reversed course. The wealthy patrons and conservative aunts who had been glaring at me just moments ago were now staring at Celeste with open, unmasked horror. The outrage that had been directed at my supposed infidelity was rapidly mutating into profound disgust at her calculated cruelty. Lorraine had covered her mouth with both hands, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. Graham took a slow step away from his sister, looking at her as if she had suddenly grown fangs. Her perfectly constructed guillotine had shattered into 1,000 pieces, but I was not finished. Proving my innocence was never the primary objective of this night. "But the real question is not whether this dossier is fake," I said, my voice dropping into a low, chilling register that demanded absolute attention. "We all know it is a fabrication. The real question is why you did it." Celeste opened her mouth, searching frantically for a retort, but her throat worked soundlessly. The predatory confidence was entirely gone, replaced by the cornered panic of a trapped animal. "This entire scandalous performance," I announced to the silent room, "is nothing but a desperately constructed smokescreen. You did not risk destroying your brother's marriage tonight because you care about his pride. You did it because you are utterly terrified of what I'm going to show him tomorrow morning in the boardroom." I turned away from the shattered remnants of my sister-in-law's fake dossier and looked directly at the crowd. The projector screen behind me shifted from the digital network logs to a sprawling, high-resolution aerial map of the Blackwater Point coastline. The thick, vibrant green canopy of the Parker family estate was clearly visible, outlined entirely by a harsh crimson border. "This is not a story about a cheating wife," I announced, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. "This has never been about my marriage. This entire spectacle was engineered to distract everyone in this room from the actual target. The real prize is the 60 acres of pristine, undeveloped coastal land sitting directly behind this inn." I pointed toward the eastern edge of the map. "At 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the Parker Family Trust is scheduled to hold a closed-door meeting to sign a massive, irrevocable development agreement with Halcyon Shore. It is a deal that will fundamentally alter the legacy of this family forever." I gave Naomi a slight nod. The aerial map shrank to the corner of the screen, making way for a scanned legal document. It was the voting rights appendix I had discovered in the basement archives. "For decades, the estate trust has required a unanimous vote between the primary heirs to liquidate any portion of the ancestral land," I explained, keeping my tone strictly informational, like a professor dissecting a historical tragedy. "Graham holds the ultimate veto power. But this specific document, a supplementary appendix supposedly signed by the late Mr. Parker, conveniently surfaces just weeks before the largest commercial acquisition in the history of this town. It fundamentally alters the voting structure. It completely neutralizes Graham's veto, granting the majority decision power to the secondary heir." I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Celeste. "It gives you the unilateral power to sell the ground right out from under your brother. That is enough." The voice did not belong to Celeste or Graham. It came from the head table. Lorraine Parker stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floorboards. Her face was flushed with a mixture of terror and furious maternal instinct. For 8 years, my mother-in-law had chosen silence to keep the peace. Now, faced with the public destruction of her daughter, she finally found her voice, and she aimed it entirely at me. "You are crossing a terrible line, Avery," Lorraine declared, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were stark white. "You have proved the photographs were false, and we are all deeply sorry for that misunderstanding. But to stand here and weaponize a petty family argument to accuse my daughter of corporate theft? You are maliciously twisting private estate matters to punish her. You are tearing this family apart." Her intervention hit the room like a shockwave. The guests, who had just begun to side with me, suddenly hesitated. The emotional weight of a grieving, desperate mother defending her child was incredibly powerful. Lorraine was leveraging her untouchable social status in the community to throw a protective shield over Celeste. Celeste instantly recognized the lifeline her mother had just thrown her. The cornered panic vanished from her eyes, replaced by a brilliant, cunning flash of survival instinct. She grabbed the microphone again, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured indignation. "Mother is right," Celeste cried out, pointing a trembling finger at the projection screen. "Look at what she's doing. Graham?" "Avery is projecting. She got caught in a lie, so she is desperately trying to change the subject by dragging our father's legal documents into the mud. She wants to keep this land exactly as it is because she uses this inn to play queen of the county. She is terrified of losing her precious power, so she is trying to make me look like a monster." It was a breathtakingly vicious pivot. She was using my own competence and dedication to the estate as evidence of a selfish power grab. I looked at Graham. My husband was standing halfway between me and his family, physically and emotionally paralyzed. He was a man being ripped in half. On one side stood the wife he had trusted and loved for 8 years, presenting him with cold, hard documents. On the other side stood his mother, shaking with rage, and his little sister, weeping and screaming that she was being framed. His face was a mask of pure agony. He wanted to believe me, but the psychological conditioning of his entire life was screaming at him to protect his bloodline. "Celeste," Graham choked out, his voice raw and broken. "Just tell me the truth. Did you touch the trust documents?" "Of course I did not," she sobbed, taking a step toward him. "I am trying to save us. Graham, the property taxes are bleeding us dry. Halcyon Shore is offering us a fortune, and Avery is trying to sabotage it just to maintain her own control over the staff and the renovations. She is manipulating you." I did not shout back. I did not engage in the emotional screaming match they desperately wanted. I knew that answering emotion with more emotion would only end in a stalemate. I had to answer them with facts. "Let us look at exactly what kind of salvation you are offering this family," I said quietly. I looked at the back of the room. The screen flashed. The forged appendix disappeared, replaced by the preliminary contract terms drafted by Halcyon Shore Redevelopment. "Graham," I said, my voice softening as I addressed my husband directly, "you told me that Celeste assured you the Halcyon deal was an eco-friendly preservation project. You told me they were only going to develop the unused marshland near the highway." Graham nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the giant wall of text. "Read Section 4, Paragraph B," I instructed. I had highlighted the specific clause in bright yellow. As Graham read the words, I watched the last remaining traces of his willful ignorance shatter. "The developer reserves the absolute right to commence immediate demolition of the structural assets located on the southern perimeter," I read aloud, ensuring the entire ballroom heard the terms, "including but not limited to the historic Victorian guest cottages and the entire southern apple orchard, to make way for a multi-story parking structure," Graham gasped, taking a sharp step back as if the screen had physically struck him. Those cottages were built by his great-grandfather. He had spent his childhood summers playing in that orchard. He had sworn on his father's grave that he would never let a single bulldozer touch that specific parcel of land. "You told me the cottages were protected," Graham whispered, turning to stare at his sister. The agonizing confusion in his eyes was rapidly hardening into something much colder. You swore to me they were written out of the demolition zone. Celeste swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. It is a standard commercial concession. Graham, we had to give them the southern ridge to secure the highest possible valuation. We can rebuild the cottages somewhere else. We need the capital. You lied to my face, Graham said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying calm. She lied to you about the cottages, I interrupted, refusing to let the momentum stall. But she did not lie to you for the sake of the family trust. She did not do this to save the inn. I signaled Naomi for the final time. The screen split in half. On the right side, a new document appeared. It was highly classified, marked with a thick red banner reading Confidential Financial Rider. This is an addendum attached to the final page of the Halcyon Shore contract, I announced. It is a secret financial rider that was intentionally withheld from the executive summary you were given to read. This rider stipulates a mandatory transaction completion consulting fee to be paid out the very second the deed is transferred tomorrow morning. The guests were entirely silent now. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was suffocating the room. Even Lorraine had stopped defending her daughter. Her eyes locked onto the word consulting fee. Would you like to tell the room how much that fee is, Elias? I asked, looking down at the table number 3. Elias Mercer looked like a man standing before a firing squad. He looked at Celeste, then at the furious faces of the town councilmen sitting nearby. His corporate survival instincts overrode whatever loyalty he owed my sister-in-law. He slowly stood up, smoothing his tie with shaking hands. The consulting fee is written for $1,200,000, Elias stated, his voice tight and defensive. And I want it on the official record, right now in front of all these witnesses, that I vehemently oppose the structure of that specific rider. It is highly irregular. But I was explicitly instructed by the secondary heir that if I disclosed the existence of that massive payout to the primary executor, the entire land acquisition would be terminated immediately. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The wealthy investors exchanged dark, knowing glances. A 7-figure secret payout was not a family business disagreement. It was corporate extortion. $1,200,000, I repeated, letting the massive sum echo over the jazz instruments resting silently on the stage. The air in the ballroom was so thick with tension you could carve it with the silver cake knife still resting on the table. Graham was staring at the secret rider, his breathing shallow and rapid. Lorraine was clutching her chest, the reality of the situation finally piercing her decades of denial. But Celeste was not finished. Her back was against the wall, but her eyes were still wild, searching frantically for a way out. She had one last card to play. The rider proved money was moving, but the name of the recipient was still blacked out on the massive screen. If she could spin the narrative just one more time, if she could cast doubt on the destination of those funds, she might still survive the night. I watched her draw breath for one final lie. She had no idea I was about to end the night with the one thing she could not outrun: proof. Celeste's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for a sympathetic face among the wealthy investors and shell-shocked relatives. She found none. I watched her gather herself for one last lie about the consulting fee. I did not give her the chance to draw the breath required to speak. I raised my hand, pointing directly at the audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. Naomi hit the master switch. The projector screen went completely black for a split second before snapping back to life with a grainy, high-contrast video feed. The timestamp in the upper right corner read Tuesday, 2 o'clock in the morning. "This is the security camera feed from the hallway leading to the family wine cellar," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, suffocating tension. The same cellar where the original estate trust documents have been kept in a fireproof safe for the last 4 decades. On the massive screen, the heavy oak door of the cellar opened. 2 figures stepped into the dim light. One was clearly recognizable as the Halcyon Shore representative Elias had brought to the property earlier that week. The other was Celeste. The ballroom watched in absolute, paralyzed silence as the digital version of my sister-in-law accepted a thick manila envelope from the representative, slipped it into her designer tote bag, and then turned toward the wall safe. Naomi's fingers danced across her keyboard. A transparent green overlay appeared across the video feed, displaying the real-time access logs from the smart lock system. "As you can clearly see," I narrated, my tone devoid of any pity. The lock was disengaged using a unique personal identification number, a number belonging exclusively to the secondary heir. She opened the safe, removed the original property deeds, and inserted the forged voting appendix. "That is a lie," Celeste hissed, but her voice was barely a whisper now, utterly stripped of its previous theatrical power. "You tampered with the video." "I did not have to," I replied smoothly, "because the state registry confirmed it for me." The video feed minimized, and an audio file waveform appeared on the screen. I pressed play. The raspy, authoritative voice of Martha Keene, the retired county notary, echoed through the ballroom speakers. "I have reviewed my official ledgers from 1998, Martha's recorded voice announced, steady and damning. "The voting rights appendix currently in circulation is a complete forgery. My signature was digitally copied, and the notary stamp uses modern laser toner, not the oil-based ink I used during my tenure. Furthermore, that specific document does not exist anywhere in the original state registry. It is a fabricated piece of paper." The audio clip ended, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The older conservative guests who had eagerly whispered about my supposed infidelity just 20 minutes ago were now staring at the floor, their faces pale with embarrassment and shock. They had been manipulated into acting as the executioners for a woman who was actively robbing her own family, but the absolute killing blow was yet to come. I turned back to the screen, where the secret financial rider was still displayed, the recipient's name hidden behind a thick black redaction bar. A moment ago, Elias Mercer confirmed the existence of a $1,200,000 consulting fee required to close this land sale, I said, pacing slowly in front of the stunned crowd. A fee demanded by Celeste herself, kept entirely secret from the primary executor of the estate. I looked directly at my mother-in-law. Lorraine was trembling violently in her chair, tears ruining her immaculate makeup. "You defended her, Lorraine," I said softly, yet loud enough for the microphone to catch every syllable. "You thought she was just being cruel to me. You thought she was trying to save the inn. Look at what she is actually saving." I gave Naomi the final nod. On the giant screen, the black redaction bar vanished. The recipient of the 7-figure payout was not a corporate consulting firm. It was a private limited liability company, and printed clearly beneath the company name was the listed sole proprietor, Celeste Parker. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. It was the sound of 100 wealthy, polite people simultaneously witnessing a horrific car crash. $1,200,000, I repeated, letting the massive number hang over her head like a guillotine blade. "That is the exact price you put on your great-grandfather's cottages. That is what you traded your father's legacy for. You were going to let Halcyon Shore bulldoze the southern orchard so you could pocket a secret fortune." Graham looked at his sister. It was not the look of an angry brother. It was the look of a man staring at a complete stranger. The lifetime of excuses he had made for her, the endless compromises he had forced me to endure to keep the peace, completely evaporated from his eyes. He saw her, truly and finally, not as a difficult sibling, but as a dangerous, venomous parasite. "It is a setup!" Celeste screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She pointed wildly at me, backing away toward the exit. "She worked with Elias to frame me. Avery hates me. She hates this family. She hired someone to fake the documents and the video to get rid of me so she can control the entire estate herself." It was a pathetic, flailing attempt to claw her way out of a grave she had dug with her own hands. I did not even bother to raise my voice. I just looked at the screen one last time. Naomi triggered the final slide. It was an email, captured directly from Celeste's outbox, sent 3 days ago to a notorious, high-priced public relations fixer in Atlanta. I read the text aloud, ensuring there was no room for misinterpretation. "I need her silenced before the Sunday morning signing. Fabricate an affair. Use the Chicago trip dates I sent you. I do not care how messy it gets. Just make sure Avery loses her voice in this family permanently." The email was the final nail. There was nowhere left for her to run, no shadow left to hide within, and no mother left to protect her. Lorraine had completely collapsed, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The matriarch, who had turned a blind eye to her daughter's toxic behavior for decades, was finally forced to swallow the bitter poison she had allowed to fester. Graham moved. He stepped past the ruined wedding cake, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying resolve. He did not walk toward his sister. He walked directly to me. For the first time in our 8-year marriage, he did not hesitate. He did not try to keep the peace, and he did not ask me to compromise. He stood firmly at my side, wrapped his hands securely around mine, and turned to face the woman who shared his blood. "Get out," Graham said. His voice was not loud, but the sheer force of it made the crystal glasses on the tables rattle. Celeste stared at him, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. "Graham, please, you cannot do this. I am your sister." "You are nothing to me," he replied, his tone as cold as the ocean wind outside. "Go upstairs, pack whatever you can carry, and leave this property tonight. If you are still on the estate grounds by sunrise, I will have the county sheriff arrest you for corporate fraud and forgery. The deal with Halcyon Shore is permanently canceled." Celeste looked around the room one last time, searching for a single ally. Even the conservative aunts who had nodded along with her lies turned their backs, refusing to meet her eye. Stripped of her power, her money, and her audience, she let out a broken, humiliated sob, turned on her heel, and fled the ballroom, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind her. The silence that followed was different from the tension that had choked the room all evening. It was the clean, exhausted silence that comes after a hurricane has finally passed. I stood there, my hand held tightly in my husband's grip, looking out at the sea of faces. I had not won this war with screaming matches, hysterical tears, or petty insults. I had won it with absolute calm, meticulous evidence, and the patience to let my enemy destroy herself. I had shown everyone in that room that the real traitor was never the woman standing quietly by the anniversary cake. The real monster was the one who viewed her own family as nothing more than a commodity, perfectly willing to sell them out for power and a secret bank account. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.